that of the church in his latter days. Certainly, he's suspicious of whether or not the church can do that. But he's not going to abandon the church. He just wants the church to take on a different form, a form that's not preoccupied by doctrine, by institution, by power, a form that doesn't bestow revelation on itself, but lets all of those questions, as he says, just sort of remain silent. They're peripheral. That's the periphery of the village. The center of the village is where we are, where we suffer, where all of us are broken, and that's where we meet. That's what I can do. Yeah, sure.
Cecil, I've been so immersed in exactly the questions you've talked about for so long I can hardly think of the question. I'm mostly amen to say. But one very interesting moment where we see that transition from a very early notion of exceptionalism, as in Winthrop, into a much more recognizable modern version, occurs just after the War of 1812 with the national anthem. Francis Scott Key writes a poem, The Defense of Fort McHenry, which we now know and sing automatically, but we only know the first verse. And it's the fourth verse that contains the ideological freight declaring that God has made and preserved us a nation, allowed us to defeat the foreign mercenaries.
Thank goodness we picked the first.
It's a little sleepy.
Or we'll be there all day before
we get there.
I remember an episode I went through in the 7th grade. This is not entirely relevant to what you just said, but in some ways it is. I was in a history class taught by a woman named Ms. Berluti, who was an intimidating force in my school. She had the physique of a middle linebacker, for one thing, and she took no guff from anyone. First day of class, she asked us to count off 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And after we did that, you know the drill, we used to do phys ed all the time, decide who gets on one side and the other. The question was, recite the first verse of the Star Spangled Banner. Most of us knew it. And then the second verse and the second verse. Of course, you didn't know there was a second verse, or third verse, or fourth verse. And if you didn't know it, Ms. Berluti would say you're just a stupid cow. She would compare you to all sorts of barnyard animals. And the rest of us are thinking, what number am I going to be? And I'm sitting right here, and I'm number 1, so I'm safe. And to this day, I have no idea why I did this, but when she came to me, she said, Mr. Eubanks, and I said, I don't think it's important to know the second and third. She grabbed me by the neck, took me to the principal's office and sat me down. And about half an hour later, I was transferred to another history course. My point to my students being a 1960s radical was born. Protest works. But you're right. And of course it was used in the Mexican Wars, it was used in the Indian Wars. And Niebuhr makes this point. He says, we can't fight a war unless it's the war to end all wars, or the war to make the world safe for democracy, or some other righteous cause that we need to confer upon ourselves. And that we somehow don't behave in the ways we do this like others behave, which of course is directly contradictory to our theology. Of course we behave like others. We are like others. Other comments or questions? Yes.
As someone who tries to be very aware of that prophetic call and occasionally to practice it, another piece of that I'm aware of is pointing out the idol of someone else and trying to replace it with my own.
Yeah.
And what does Bonhoeffer or Cecil Eubanks, how do you address that line between the prophetic voice and yet the sinfulness within each prophet?
That's another question I can't answer, but I'll give it a shot. I'll tell you what Bonhoeffer said. In his early days as a pastor, he gathered together a community of people and lived what we would regard as a monastic existence. Lots of prayer, lots of silent meditation. Indeed, he was criticized by the evangelical Lutherans because it was just a little too Catholic for their taste. But the reason he was doing it was precisely what you're referring to. These were the moments, the long moments of introspection he thought necessary to build up the humility needed when you encounter the world. Because he knew encountering the world always is a seduction of power and the sense that we're going to confer on ourselves yet again the God that we cannot name. Now, whether we engage in that kind of meditative searching or whether we simply try to be humble creatures or whether we simply and always have this sense of hesitation and yet and doubt and yet leap into it nonetheless, knowing that what we do may in fact not be as effective as we think it can or should be, is the only response I can give. I love Paul Tillich's phrase about all of this. Tillich was talking about what you raised, which is the issue of power, individual egoism. He was also talking about the world. The world is a formidable thing. There's a lot to do. And we don't have much time to do it and get it done as we want. In the face of that, Tillich has this marvelous, actually there's two phrases. One is, we walk on the boundary, always on the boundary. And we do things, we do the prophetic if we can, in spite of the fact. In spite of the fact. I love it. In spite of it. That it may be ineffective, that it may be laden with our own egoistic power, that it may in fact alleviate the suffering of another, in spite of it. Walking that. And what he meant by boundary is the relationship between the horizontal world, the world in which we live every day, and the vertical, the world of transcendence. We move from one to the other and back. Constant, as the Greeks would call it, self-examination in this process. Constant self-examination. The Aristotelian notion of virtue requires that. Well, thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Only temporary. Hey Mel, how are you doing?
Kind of talking, have to hang on to every word.
Yes.
needed about a 15-minute break between sentences to
Absorb, I know.
It'll be on YouTube shortly.
well, is that what this is?
Yeah.
What did you say when you got them? Because I was going to have to move that camera.
Oh, I see.
See?